Hello everyone, this is Michael, and today we're going to take a deep dive into the studio catalog of one Van Halen. Van Halen, of course, is the hard party rock band that emerged from Southern California in the mid to late 70s and immediately took the rock world by storm. They were fueled by the revolutionary guitar capabilities of Eddie Van Halen, a party-hardy attitude, and the flamboyant onstage antics of David Lee Roth. And these quickly compelled them to be one of the most successful live bands in the 80s and 90s. They were arguably the most popular hard rock act of that era, and in addition, they had tremendous success selling records. Every album went platinum. They sold tens of millions of albums in aggregate, and they had at least, I believe, 4 number one albums. The Van Halen catalog can be broken into 2 eras. Of course, we have the original David Lee Roth era, which consisted of Eddie Van Halen on guitar, his brother Alex Van Halen on drums, Michael Anthony on bass, and those high-pitched backing vocals, and of course David Lee Roth as the lead vocalist. And after the first 6 albums, they seamlessly transitioned to the Van Hagar era when Sammy Hagar replaced David Lee Roth, and that outfit released 5 studio albums, 4 of which went on to be ranked number 1. They were all platinum sellers. And in total, we have 12 albums, I believe. As I say, they were merged from the 70s. Yeah, 12 studio albums, which is 132 songs and 9 hours of music, which, considering how legendary and long-lived Van Halen is and how many albums they put out, 9 hours is not a tremendous amount of music. But their impact is indisputable. So let's get into it. The first studio album by Van Halen is their debut album titled simply Van Halen. And this was a huge and massive hit right out of the gate, and as somebody who was 12 or 13, depending on when it came out, I can tell you that it's impossible to overstate what an impact and kind of how fresh and revolutionary and new Van Halen was when they emerged in 1978. Prior to Van Halen coming, bands that played hard rock, as Van Halen did, generally came out wearing denim and black. Bands like Black Sabbath and UFO and the Scorpions and Judas Priest and Thin Lizzy all kind of looked the same, denim and black leather, and they appealed to male men, young men mostly. Van Halen, by contrast, was not about being dark and scary looking. They were about being bright and let's have a party. So rather than black leather, David Lee Roth is wearing white tight white spandex pants, and they're wearing red leather, and there's lots of bright colors, and the band sang, and their live shows were all about let's all have a party. And there was a very strong female contingent to their fandom, which was not true of these other hard rock bands of the time. More importantly, we have Eddie Van Halen's guitar work. Simply put, rock music, and really honestly music in general, can be segmented into 2 time periods: before Eddie Van Halen and after. That's how revolutionary his guitar work was. There's still nobody to this day that's quite sounded like him, even though he spawned an absolute entire multiple generations of imitators. When I first heard the Eruption, which we listened to at the beginning, I mean, I did not understand how somebody could make those sounds on the guitar. Eddie Van Halen is truly, in my opinion, the most innovative and revolutionary and influential guitarist of all time. I know a lot of people cite Jimi Hendrix, and I just don't hear Jimi Hendrix as being that significantly different from every other guitarist of his era, whereas Eddie Van Halen, literally nobody else sounded like him, and it took a couple years for anybody to start imitating him, and he had zillions of imitators. Trust me, by the mid-80s, any hard rock or heavy metal band had to have an Eddie Van Halen clone trying to play guitar for them. And all this is captured in their debut album, Van Halen. This is an album of party anthems. These are not songs that are talking about deep topics. This is not Tool exploring the spiritual makeup of mankind. These are songs about let's have a drink, let's turn the radio up, and let's drive real fast and chase girls. That's basically it. Running with the Devil, Eruption, You Really Got Me, Ain't Talking About Love. Even the song names are indicative of what we got going on here. It's also notable that the album itself is only, I believe, 34 minutes long. I got my notes here, which I've completely ignored until now. Yeah, this is only 36 minutes spread across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 to 11 songs. So basically about 3-minute songs each. Nothing very long here. It's all fast and snappy. The songs are all catchy and have these great melodies. A lot of them have these very anthemic sing-along choruses. And this is just an up-tempo, fun party album. It's also notable that this was recorded in only 3 weeks using relatively limited production. I believe that if you put headphones on, the guitar is on one side and the bass is on the other. This is not Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. And the thing is, none of that matters because it's all about partying and having fun and singing along. And this was an immediate hit. This album has sold 10 million units. It's funny because it emerged when punk was really ascendant and big, and punk had this very do-it-yourself attitude. And this album does too. And yet Van Halen wasn't considered a punk band, and they aren't punk. They don't play punk music. But in terms of the making of the album, this has a very punk attitude. It's really simple, straightforward stuff. You've got, like I say, you got short, snappy songs. The opener, it's not the opener, which I always thought Running with the Devil is the opener. And in many ways, that is a classic opener. It's got that doom, 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 slow bass opening. But I always thought Eruption should have been the very first song. Just because it opens real cool, it hits you in its face, and you immediately get Eddie Van Halen's dazzling guitar work. You Really Got Me, of course, is a cover of the Kinks songs, and Van Halen did not shy away from doing covers. I believe almost every one of their, not everyone, but many of their albums have covers, and frequently they have multiple covers. We got multiple covers on this album, as Ice Cream Man is also a cover. But You Really Got Me, I say this about covers all the time. If you're going to do a cover, you need to do it better than the original, or you need to do it different than the original. In this instance, Van Halen definitely does it better. I would much rather listen to Van Halen's version of You Really Got Me than the Kinks version. Even though Van Halen doesn't do it all that differently, they just do it better. It is interesting because on You Really Got Me in the middle, like I say, these are very short songs, not ambitious arrangements. It's pretty much verse, chorus, but it seems like every song has a little breakdown in the middle of it where they slow things down, kind of AC/DC style. Ain't Talking About Love is basically kind of the same song as You Really Got Me, but it's Van Halen's version of it, and frankly, I think it's a better song. The riff here is awesome, and this has one of the most quintessential rock moments ever when they get to the end of the song, and hey, 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 dun, 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 hey, hey, hey. And that is that anthemic kind of party atmosphere that Van Halen just nurtured in their early days. When you had 20,000 people and the lights on and everybody screaming, hey, hey, hey. I mean, that's as rock and roll as it gets. I'm the one that's got this really cool sounding guitar sound to it that I think is awesome. Or, I'm sorry, Atomic Punk is the one that has that very original, interesting, creative guitar opening to it. Feel Your Love Tonight, Little Darlin', Ice Cream Man are all kind of fun, breezy, hard rock songs. And then On Fire is this probably the heaviest song on the debut album. and it's more of a hard rock song than a party song. Ice Cream Man, I mentioned, is a cover, is originally sung by John Brim and recorded in 1968, even though it had roots going back to the 50s. Has a great Eddie Van Halen guitar solo in it, but it's really Dave doing his kind of vaudeville bit that is the primary framework of that song. And that's one thing that's interesting. This is a hard rock band, hard rock music, but their frontman, David Lee Roth, number one, he's not the most technically gifted singer. He's not really traditionally a very good singer. But he is a born showman. Sometimes too much so. Like, I think he can veer off into clowndom sometimes, where he's just being a clown. But it brought an element that you didn't really find in these hard rock bands generally, where Dave would be willing to do these kind of vaudeville or show business type things that added a glitzy entertainment value to Van Halen that, like I say, was not found on other hard rock bands of that era. Alright, so, like I say, this album was just huge. From the minute it came out, it had a huge commercial impact, moving tens of millions of units. Like I said, it had a big cultural impact two ways. One is Van Halen quickly established a reputation as a live act that was unlike anything you'd ever seen and that you couldn't miss. They very famously were blowing Black Sabbath off the stage as an opener during Black Sabbath's last tour before Ozzy Osbourne's dismissal from the band, when they were touring Never Say Die, and a bloated, drug-addicted Black Sabbath standing on stage singing their slow-paced doom songs after Van Halen came out for 45 minutes and had the fans screaming and yelling was a difficult thing to follow up, and that tour was well known for Van Halen blowing them off the stage. By their next album, Van Halen was already a headliner, headlining 20,000-seat arenas, and they would stay that way for the duration of their career. They were always able to headline arenas and stadiums and festivals, a huge, massively successful live act. So Van Halen toured incessantly after their debut album, and yet less than a year after the release of their debut album, they went into the studio and recorded Van Halen II, which came out just the following year. And you can see I give it a lower score. Like the first album, this was recorded in just a couple weeks using what were, even at that time, relatively primitive recording techniques. And the whole objective was to get in, record, so that the band could go back out and tour some more, which is exactly what they did. Now, in my opinion, I think the songs just aren't as good. I would say Van Halen 2 is almost identical to Van Halen 1 in many ways, just not, the songs just aren't as good. We can go through them one by one. You're No Good is a relatively mid-paced rocker. It's a cover of a Linda Ronstadt song. Dance the Night Away was an obvious attempt at a radio hit. It has a, some people would say it's a disco vibe to it. I don't think it's really quite that way, but it is designed to be a kind of dance-along, sing-along song. Somebody Get Me a Doctor is a great hard rocker, in my opinion. Same thing with Bottoms Up. These are fun party songs that would have fit right in the original album. Out of Love Again is kind of an underrated deep cut. I don't think it gets as much love as it deserves. Has some great vocal harmonies. Same thing with Light Up the Sky, which, why is it listed last year? It shouldn't be last. But here's kind of the challenge, is those songs weren't very notably different or distinguished from songs from the first album. And then you don't have that kind of smack in the face that Eddie Van Halen's guitars were on the first album, because he's already done it and now you're hearing it the second time. We do have Spanish Fly, which is another 1 minute Eddie Van Halen guitar solo, but in this case it's on the acoustic. And I read from Nancy Wilson, and I just recently heard an account from Nancy Wilson of Heart, who played guitar for Heart, most notably acoustic guitar. She found out Eddie, when they were touring I think they were playing some same festivals as Van Halen. She found out Eddie Van Halen didn't have an acoustic guitar, so she gave him one, and he used it to do this Spanish fly solo, which is really awesome, but it is kind of eruption on the acoustic guitar, if you will. Still, you can see 80s across the board, except for a couple 60s. We don't have any really duds in here. In many ways, this album's only 32 minutes, so if we add the first album and the second album up, we've only got 66 minutes of music, which means it would be a good start for a Tool album, or a Tool CD. But from the perspective of 1978, 1979, the band has now put out two great albums, and then they went out and toured and conquered the world. I mean, they were a headliner. They would be the main act at festivals. They very quickly established themselves as a major player in the hard rock music world in the late 70s. And Van Halen II just added to that. It just kept the momentum going. Similar to the band's schedule, after touring for basically a year after the release of Van Halen II, they immediately go back into the studio and record Women and Children First, which came out in 1980. So this is true of many bands of this era back then in the 70s and 80s, where you would release an album generally once a year, and in between your releases you spent the most time touring, and there was really not much time for bands to get away from each other, not be on that treadmill of or conveyor belt of tour, record, and Van Halen was definitely one of those bands. Women and Children First in some ways is not much different than the first two albums. Again, it's only 38 minutes, so we're not talking a long album. I said 38 minutes, I mean 34 minutes. However, we do only have 8 songs, and so the songs are actually longer. We have a couple songs that are even longer than 5 minutes and one that's almost 6 minutes, whereas no song had been longer than about 4 minutes and 15 seconds before Women and Children First. In addition, we're starting to paint on different parts of the palette now. We've got what I would say are more ambitious arrangements. We've got a darker, kind of heavier album. We've got some more lighthearted moments. I say lighthearted, not in silly ways like we had with the first two albums, but dedicated to playing something that's not pyrotechnics on the guitar or anthemic choruses. So let's get into the individual songs here. And the Cradle Will Rock would fit on into the first two albums. It's a typical teen rebellious song. It is the first time that Van Halen ever featured keyboards on any of their songs, although very rudimentary, and not played by Eddie Van Halen, but played by Michael Anthony in this instance. Everybody Wants Some, another anthemic party rock song that works brilliantly. It's got this very cool tribal drum opening, and David Lee Roth doing his typical vocal shenanigans over it. This is a minor hit, not a huge hit. It is 5 minutes long, so it's a little longer, and it's got that traditional Van Halen breakdown in the middle, and then where Dave starts doing his naughty talk, if you will. Fools is nearly 6 minutes long, and it begins with David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen doing a call and response thing, which bands like Led Zeppelin did quite a bit. It's a bit frustrating to me because Eddie Van Halen, I think, is playing it clean and trying to do it for real, and then David Lee Roth can't really sing in tune to what he's hearing, so it comes across a little sloppy, it's a little messy. However, David Lee Roth got away with a lot of that stuff because he could do it in a charming way. Romeo Delight, this is a really hard, fast, rocking song, and again, it has the traditional breakdown in the middle. And then we have this song we're listening to, which is actually two songs. I listed as one. Tora Tora, which is a short, I believe, minute and a half instrumental, and then Loss of Control, which is a very, very fast, aggressive song. And I love this piece, and I wish Van Halen had done more of this. The Tora Tora is heavy, and it's almost borderline heavy metal. and it's got almost Sabbath-like riffs, and I wish Van Halen would have dabbled in this area more than they did, because it's just a couple minutes here, and I thought they could have done more with that. I think this song, this combo, Tour Tour and Lost Control, is kind of Van Halen at their most ambitious in this period. And that's, like I said, I kind of wish they'd done that more. Take Your Whiskey Home, another anthemic, let's drink and have fun and chase girls rocker. And then Could This Be Magic? This is great. This is very lighthearted, got an almost island sound to it. There's no drums, there's no bass, it's just acoustic guitars and the band singing. It's got some great vocal harmonies, and that's what I'm talking about. This is that a bit of light to the shade that they're doing elsewhere on their albums, and I think that combined with the Tour Tour, Lots of Control, and In a Simple Rhyme sounds a little different too. This is a slightly more mature song. It's got a time change in the middle of it, as opposed to like a breakdown like they usually do. It combines both acoustic and electric guitars in ways that the band often didn't do. Those three songs, In a Simple Rhyme, Could This Be Magic, Tortora, Loss of Control, I think just makes it a more mature, more ambitious effort from the band than their first two albums, which is why I give it the 91 that I give it, and it's arguably my favorite album by the band. Now again, after the release of Women and Children, Van Halen tours all over. I think they toured in Europe and Japan on this tour. They would often, their shows were so in demand, they often played 2 or 3 nights in cities. I know that in Dallas, for instance, they played 2 nights. And then just a year later, came out with Fair Warning in 1981. So at this point, they've now released 4 albums, and they toured Fair Warning just like they did these other albums, and they've been going at it 4 years straight. And you can see that I think very highly of this album as well. I think of it similar to Women and Children First in that it's got more ambitious musical things going on. The rhythm section in particular, I think this is the high point for Alex Van Halen and Michael Anthony. I think that neither one of those guys are guys that would rank real high on greatest drummer or greatest bass player of all time. Michael Anthony in particular, I think, is quite limited on the bass, although I think he's one of the most outstanding backup singers in any hard rock band ever. This was recorded, took a little more time than the first 3 albums, but they're still not spending tons of time in the studio. This album has a much darker tone. The very first song, Mean Street, is a song about living on the streets and fighting and being tough and all that. It also features one of the absolute best Eddie Van Halen guitar intros ever, where he's using this kind of slap technique, not his usual hammer-on technique, but his slap technique to create this uniquely Eddie Van Halen guitar sound, the kind of thing I haven't heard on any album by any artist since. We got a lot of great songs. Mean Street, Center Swing. Those are Center Swing is again a high energy party song. Same with Dirty Movies, which is about what you'd think it's about. I like Hear About It Later. It's got this really kind of cool, quiet guitar intro from Eddie Van Halen. And I think at this point, Eddie's really starting to explore the different sounds that he can make with his guitar. So it's not just how fast can you play. He's getting into textures and ambience. And, I really like the way that he explored the guitar that way. And I kind of wish that the band had allowed more for that, to be honest. Unchained is probably the most popular radio-friendly pop song on the album. And Push Comes to Shove, this is where I think the band again is painting on different parts of the canvas here. This is a very slow, moody song, and it's the kind of song where David Lee Roth actually gives us a quality, subtle vocal effort here, and I'm like, why couldn't we get more of that more often? Because too often I felt like David Lee Roth descended into just almost a generic trope of himself at times. So This Is Love is an attempt at another radio-friendly song. This didn't work. I don't think the chorus is very good. Then we get the final two songs. Sunday Afternoon in the Park is Eddie Van Halen's first attempt at the synthesizer. And as a keyboard player, I think he's a really, really good guitarist. Never understood Eddie Van Halen's fascination with the piano and the synthesizer, because every time he's playing the synthesizer, I'm wondering why can't he be playing the guitar. He is pedestrian at best as a keyboard / synthesizer player. And in this particular effort, it's plodding and boring and goes nowhere. And I just don't... It's only, I think, 2 minutes long. Yeah, something like that. It does not contribute to the album in any meaningful way. And then the last song, One Foot Out the Door, this is a very short, high-paced rocker, and it's David Lee Roth singing about his Saturday night being ruined because his date's husband is coming home to beat him up, which is very on brand for David Lee Roth and Van Halen. Still, overall, another just outstanding album. This is now 4 in a row. We've had one album each year from 1978, 79, 80, and 81. And while the band is successful in every way imaginable, like I say, selling out arenas, headlining festivals, touring all over the world, selling millions of albums, they were all over anything that was associated with rock music at that time, magazines. MTV was not really a big thing yet. I'm not even sure it was out in 1981. But radio, magazines, and they were kind of notorious. They had the infamous Brown M&M incident in, I think it was Arizona. They had this famous clause in their contract that said they wanted bowls of M&Ms in their dressing rooms, but there could be no brown M&Ms. They had to be removed, and apparently the brown M&Ms were not removed, so they decided to trash the place. That was kind of rock back then, and bands tried sometimes to live up to the hype. And because there wasn't that much coverage, the only, like I say, radio and magazines, that was it. Stories took on these kind of legendary statuses, and who knows how much of it was really true and who wasn't. But man, from a fan's perspective, there was nothing not to like about the band and where they were at this point. And I can remember hearing Diverdown, their next album, was going to be released. And I remember I was at high school and I was at my locker, and I had a guy who had his locker next to me. We barely knew each other. We rarely saw each other. But he happened to see that I had a Van Halen cover on one of my books, and he said, "Oh, the new album's going to come out today. Have you read it?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I'm getting it. I plan to get it." And then he said, "You never know if it'll be any good, but you got to figure it probably will be." And it dumbstruck me that he thought it might not be good, because it never occurred to me that it might not be good. And yet, when Diverdown came out, it wasn't very good. To be fair to the band, there's a argument to be made why Diverdown is a disappointment. Like I say, at this point, by 1982, the band had been on that rock and roll assembly line for 5 straight years, practically. They'd go in and record an album in 2 or 3 weeks. They'd immediately be sent out on the road. They'd be traveling all over the world when they were done. And they're partying hard, all right? These are young men. They were superstars. They had tons of groupies and fans. And, you know, they were living the lifestyle for sure. And they'd get back home and the record company would want a new album. So after Fair Warning, the band did make a single song that was a cover of Roy Orbison's Pretty Woman. It became a huge hit, including a music video that I think got banned on MTV and then later won an award. Is that right? I think so. But the song became a big, massive hit. And the original plan was that they were just going to release that song, and then they were going to take some time off. And then they were going to get together and take time to write a real album. And the record company pressured them because the single of Pretty Woman had been so successful. It was released prior to Diverdown being released. They basically pressured the band to go into the studio immediately and create their next album, which they did. It's called Diverdown, and it's just not very good. This is barely an album. Okay, it's only 32 minutes long, and while we have 12 songs here, there's very few actual songs. We have 4 covers. Where Have All the Good Times Gone, Pretty Woman, Dancing in the Street, and Happy Trails. 4 covers. While Pretty Woman was a big hit, I think it's a terrible cover. Like I said earlier, either be better or different, it's neither. And it's really a kind of generic. In fact, all of these covers, Where Have All the Good Times Gone, Pretty Woman, and Dancing in the Street, are generic, uninspired, and in my opinion, unnecessary. So, and then you add Happy Trails, which is really just the band a cappella in the studio doing an off-key version of, what was the guy's name? Roy Rogers' song that used to be sung on these cowboy shows. It's an embarrassing effort, in my opinion. So right away, 4 of the 12 songs are throwaway covers. Then we get 3 mediocre instrumentals in Cathedral and Intruder, which is the opening to Pretty Woman, and then we get little guitars. 3 instrumentals. The Cathedral and Intruder are again Eddie messing around on his let's see, Cathedral is 80 seconds of finger tapping with a volume pedal effect. It's not very inspired, in my opinion. Intruder, as I say, is the intro to Pretty Woman. It's interesting, but it's just a pretty generic drum beat with some guitar noodlings. And then Little Guitars is actually the intro to the full song, and it's not Eddie Van Halen doing pyrotechniques, but it's at least interesting guitar work. So that only leaves us with 5 actual songs, all of which are short, and as you can see, I don't think they're really all that good. Only The Full Bug is one that I really like. And that's the only song that carries... Like, it's the only song that you could take and put on any other Van Halen album, and it might actually fit in. And I can remember at the time when I bought Diverdown, I was young here. I'm like 17 at this point. I really felt like I'd been ripped off. Like, this wasn't a real effort. Like, this was a attempt by the band and the record company to exploit fans. And that really did sour me on Van Halen in a way that I never really recovered from. Before that, I had been an unabashed, energetic fan, but I really didn't like the way things went down with Diverdown, and many things that happened after that with the band kind of confirmed my general feelings. So that was a turning point for me. Now, it didn't stop me from seeing the band. I saw the band 5 times in the David Lee Roth era. I saw them at the Texas Jam when they opened for Heart and Boston. They were on their second album then. I saw them tour as headliners on the and Women and Children First in Dallas at Reunion Arena, on the Meansteets tour at Reunion Arena, and on the Diverdown tour at Reunion Arena. So I saw them at all these shows, and they were always great. They were fantastic. They always put on these great, fun, high-energy shows. David Lee Roth was born as... From everything I understand, David Lee Roth is an asshole and a jerk in person, and he's very egotistical and loud and obnoxious from everything that I've ever seen or heard, and I don't think even he would most argue those points. But as a long-haired rock and roll guy in spandex pants standing on stage in front of 20,000 people, the dude was made to do it. He could lead. That flamboyant frontman is something that I think a lot of modern rock bands struggle. They don't have anybody that can fulfill that role the way David Lee Roth could. Nevertheless, I don't think very highly of Diverdown. And Eddie Van Halen wasn't exactly proud of it either. And he was determined for the next album to be a more robust effort. And towards that, he had built a studio in his home, which eventually became known as 5150 Studio. 5150, by the way, is the code used by police to indicate somebody who is having like a psychotic event and needs to be hospitalized rather than jailed, I think. Something like that. But the next album, which would become as 1984, and you can see I give it a 74, which is high, but not as high as the earlier albums. However, this is a much more ambitious album than Diverdown. This is a real album. And at this point, the band is actually starting to splinter. David Lee Roth and Ted Templeman, who was the band's producer on all these albums, who produced the very first album, they wanted to just keep going with party songs and 3-minute rockers and let's record fast and dirty and get back out on the road. Eddie Van Halen wanted to write more mature songs. He also wanted to play the keyboards a lot more. And 1984 was when he kind of took control of the band and started doing that. So not only did they take more time writing these songs, it took a full 3 months to record. So they spent a long time recording the album, and it sounds so much better than anything they've recorded before. To be fair, Ted Templeman's primitive recording techniques were really quite effective. Those first 5 albums don't sound bad. Diverdown doesn't sound great to me, but the first 4 albums sound really good, even though they use bare bones recording techniques. But 1984 is a much more polished record, more akin to other rock albums from that era when recording techniques could be as clinical and clean as, I mean, you had bands like Rush and who could seemingly, it seemed like it was recorded in a NASA clean room, how sophisticated the production was on some of the albums in the 80s. Still, like I say, this is mostly written in the studio, and David Lee Roth and Ted Templeman did not have nearly as much input. This is very much an Eddie Van Halen album. It was massively successful, spawning 4, let me see my numbers here, had 4 hit singles. The song Jump reached number 1, which was the band's first number 1 hit. This album also sold more than 10 million units. It was the most successful album other than the debut album up to this point. Combined synth rock and pop rock and hard rock into this very massive commercial and critical success. It also expanded the band's audience. Before 1984, Van Halen was a hard rock party band that did attract a female audience, but it attracted a certain kind of female audience. With 1984, this just became mass popularity, where people who maybe were going to see bands like whereas before, fans that like bands like Iron Maiden might have liked Van Halen. Now you had fans of Journey liking Van Halen, and it just expanded their audience significantly. They also had hits on MTV. Both Panama and Hot for Teacher was a notorious misogynistic MTV hit with teachers, dressed in short skirts and high heels and that kind of thing. I'll Wait is a very keyboard-oriented, very popish song that was also a hit. Like I say, Jump was a big hit. It's not my favorite song. 1984 is another short instrumental, again, keyboard-driven, that it just doesn't do a lot. None of Eddie Van Halen's keyboard work is really inspiring or great to me or compelling. It's adequate, but nothing that they couldn't have hired somebody else to do and let Eddie play the guitars. So 1984 comes out. It's a big hit. The band, I believe, they had their biggest tour ever after that. And I saw them, I believe it was at the near end of the tour. And I think they did either 4 or 6 nights in Dallas. That's how big they were. They were playing Reunion Arena, which is a 20,000 seat arena. And they were doing 4 or 6 nights there. And selling all of them. Selling out all of them. They were really, really popular. And they combined, like I say, the commercial success of their studio albums. And then their live shows were notorious and always highly entertaining, if not always the most polished shows. So, ostensibly, the band is a huge, massive success at this point. But internally, they are fracturing. I know at some point in this era, the band had always credited every song to every member of the band. So, David Lee Roth, Eddie Van Halen, Michael Anthony, Alex Van Halen all got credit for every song. And drinking had become an issue with a number of the members of the band. I know at one point, the Van Halen brothers got together and questioned why Michael Anthony was getting credit, because he really rarely contributed to the writing of songs. And I know that Eddie Van Halen at times grew frustrated with Michael Anthony's limited bass skills. I know there were some songs where he ended up having to teach Michael Anthony how to play the bass. And then you had David Lee Roth. He had released a solo album, or a solo EP that had become popular. It had covers of California Girls and some other, non-hard rock type songs. And after 1984, he decided to split the band, and I think they were pretty happy to let him go. Now, after that, the band struggled to find a replacement. They approached Patti Smith of Scandal and asked her to join. She turned them down. They approached John Hall of Hall & Oates fame, and he also turned them down. And it was just happenstance. Eddie Van Halen was a avid car collector, and the guy that he worked with, the mechanic that he used to work on his guitars, was also a mechanic for Sammy Hagar, who's also a car enthusiast. And the mechanic suggested to Eddie Van Halen, hey, why not Sammy Hagar? And when Sammy Hagar and Eddie Van Halen got together, they say the chemistry was instantaneous, that the songwriting came pretty easily and pretty smooth. And within a very short period of time, they came out with 5150, which you can see I'm not a huge fan of. Now, full disclosure here. If we were to go back to 1986 and you were to ask me before 5150 came out what my excitement level was for the new Van Halen with Sammy Hagar as the lead singer, I would have said 0. I was not a Sammy Hagar fan. I had seen him in concert open for other bands, and I didn't like his onstage banter or antics. Vocally, he's better than David Lee Roth, but that's a really low, technically he's better than David Lee Roth, but barely. He's got a very limited voice, in my opinion, but more importantly, his voice annoys me. I always find myself kind of cringing at it. So, when I heard he had joined Van Halen, I kind of wrote it off, similar to I wasn't a fan of David Lee Roth's solo stuff, and so I'm 17, 18, by this time I'm 20 years old, 1986, and I'm listening to heavy metal, Queensryche and Metallica and Iron Maiden, and I didn't think of myself as a frat bro kind of guy into that kind of music like Sammy Hagar did. So then, when the album comes out, and it's got that very first song, which is called Good Enough. I have to check because I don't actually know. But that's the one that opens with just Sammy Hagar saying, "Hello, baby." And all that did was convince me that I was right not to be interested. I don't like that party bro, frat bro kind of sound. And I feel like this entire era of Van Hagar is pretty much that. I feel like many of these songs are generic corporate rock. They are, when I listen to things like Why Can't This Be Love or Best of Both Worlds, I'm like, this is nowhere, this is light years away from Atomic Punk and Eruption and that revolutionary party band that emerged in 1978. This is a corporate rock giant playing middle-of-the-road songs for a middle-of-the-road audience, and I wasn't interested in it, and I didn't listen to it. It's only in the last few years that I even got these albums and gave them a real opportunity. And if I could go back, I would have never made that purchase. You're going to see I don't like these songs at all. However, it's no denying that this version of Van Halen was extremely successful, more successful than the David Lee Roth version. 5150 was a massive, huge platinum selling hit. The next album was too. They were touring and selling out, and they were more popular as Van Hagar than they had been as Van Halen. As for the songs, one other thing is, like, David Lee Roth was always a bit of a clown and didn't take himself too seriously, and that was part of the charm. Is he never pretended to be an elite caliber singer. He always considered himself an entertainer. His job was, let's go out and make people have fun, and he was good at that. Sammy Hagar didn't have that kind of inner self-awareness that, hey, let's not take ourselves so seriously, let's just have fun. And as a result, I think the whole party-hardy element of the band kind of disappeared. I call it, like, I feel like the initial version of Van Halen was a party band, and the second version was what I call a frat bro band. Now, you could argue that frat bros are just about partying and having fun, but I feel the frat bro one is uglier and less appealing, less inclusive than a party band. I don't know, that's just me, alright? I'm just rambling at this point. As for these songs, Why Can't This Be Love? That guitar sound, that fuzzy guitar sound, I find so annoying. And it's got this simple sing-along chorus that, like I say, it's clearly targeted mainstream rock audiences and not hard rock audiences. Get Up is the only song that, in my opinion, distinguishes itself. Of course, it's the fastest, hardest rocking song. Dreams is just this syrupy, synthy stuff. Summer Nights, generic mid-tempo pop rock, immediately forgettable. Whenever I do these ranking the studio catalog videos, I'll start by just putting random songs on a playlist and listening to any song from any era. But then right before I do the video, I'll listen to the album sequentially. Complete album, one after the other. When I was listening to any song at any time, like a mix, the Van Hagar songs didn't annoy me as much. But when I had to listen to one Van Hagar album after another, by about the middle of the second album, I had had enough. I found this stuff to be repetitive and annoying and just not very entertaining. So I'm going to go through these relatively fast because I just didn't have a good time doing it. I've never really liked this stuff all that much to begin with. 5150, I've given it a 58. OU 812, I got a slightly higher 62. It's not much different than the other one, than 5150. Again, this is a massive hit. Had 4 top 40 singles. When It's Love, Finish What You Started, Black and Blue, Feel So Good. Am I in the right album? Yeah, okay. I will say these songs are longer. We got 5 songs that are over 5 minutes and one that is 7 minutes. Almost every one of these ratings, if you got me to give the rating after I just listened to 5150, they'd probably drop down. I'm not sure I'd give Sucker in a 3-piece or AFU a 4-star. Source of infection, that fit right in with 1984, as Eddie employs his traditional guitar sound instead of that fat, effect-laden poppy sound that he employed so much during this era. Love Walks In, just really syrupy, sweet, mindless synth rock. There's just so much here that I don't like. I don't like Eddie Van Halen's guitar sound. He doesn't have nearly as many fiery guitar solos or really innovative, compelling guitar sounds. The songs are frequently, like I say, aimed at, what's to me seemed like 35-year-olds at that time when I was 20. And it just seemed corporate rock, uninspired, predictable, generic. A lot of people loved it. I wasn't one of them. After VHIII, the band came out with ForUnLawfulCarnalKnowledge. Now, this is a full 3 years later, so they took a while between releases. In addition, they started scaling back the synths, and they claimed this was a return to roots and more guitar-oriented. They also brought back Ted Templeman as producer. VHIII had been self-produced. But I didn't even realize until I was doing this video, research for this video, ForUnLawfulCarnalKnowledge, which I always thought was a pretty dumb name. But if you put the first letter of each words together, you get F-U-C-K. Ooh, that's funny, innovative, clever. That's how I feel about this entire era. One thing I would say about all these albums, 5150, VHIII, and FUCK, the fun factor is just completely missing. Like, whatever you wanted to say about early Van Halen, it always was up-tempo, energetic, and fun. And without David Lee Roth, all of that is gone. And at this point, I think Eddie Van Halen in particular is suffering from various, too much alcohol for the most part. I don't even know if I can go into these individually songs, like what I can say. Pound Cake, I remember writing this. It's like, it actually sounds pretty good when you listen to it, but it's instantly forgettable. Judgment Day, I gave this an 80. Same thing with Pleasure Dome. If I were to grade these now, they'd get 60 at highest, and a number of these other songs I'd take from 60s down to 40s, because like I say, when I listened to these Van Hagar albums back to back to back, I found them tedious and almost impossible to listen to. Mostly because of Hagar's voice, the uninspired musical efforts. The rhythm section has been watered down to just very generic at this point. I just find very little redeeming to any of these albums, any of these songs, and if you make me listen to Van Hagar sing more than 2 or 3 songs in a row, I start, wanting to put forks in my eyes. And I gotta say this, everything I know about Sammy Hagar is that he's like a cool guy. He comes across as a very genuine, warm person, a caring person, somebody who treated people properly from everything that I've read and heard, whereas Alex and Eddie Van Halen especially were notorious for basically being dickheads, especially Eddie. If he got drunk, he was known to be abusive. Later in life, he really fell apart. He wouldn't bathe, would wear the same clothes over and over. His teeth were rotting out. Eddie Van Halen really suffered and made the people around him suffer. And from what I've heard, everybody that was ever in the band has problems with Eddie and Alex. David Lee Roth got tired of him. They turned on Michael Anthony, kicked him out of the band, and Michael Anthony has never said much about them. And then Sammy Hagar had multiple meltdowns with them, and the common denominator and all that is always Eddie Van Halen and Alex Van Halen, and they seem to be very difficult to work with. So while I don't like Sammy Hagar as an entertainer, as a singer, everything I know about him as a person is that he's a pretty high caliber character, which cannot be said for Eddie and Alex. Now, I have not done a ton of research on these guys, okay? So it's possible I don't have a perfect read on the situation. But from what I have read, it seems pretty clear that the Van Halen brothers were a difficult combo to work with. After ForUnLawfulCarnalKnowledge, it's a full 4 years later that we get Balance, which is the final Sammy Hagar album. You can see that I give this a better score, a 70. Again, I'm not sure if I were to rate all these songs again right now that I would give so many 80s to these songs. Like I say, by the time I was listening to these albums over and over again, I was finding it almost unlistenable, anything that involved Sammy Hagar. I do think the songs are better here. Like Don't Tell Me What I Can Do, at least it sounds different. It's not like a generic rocker. It's got an interesting instrumental section, which is the most compelling thing about it. Big Fat Money, this is a good, great hard rocking throwback song. Musically, I think it's outstanding. Again, Hagar's vocals drive me crazy a bit. Seventh Seal, I give 4 stars here, but my notes say that if I were to rate it now, I might only give it 2. I just found it... Can't Stop Loving You, this is just absolute cringe, paint by numbers. Should be 2 stars, maybe even a 1, to be honest. I don't want to spend a lot of time on these albums because I don't like them. I did not like them. I didn't think I would like them before Van Hagar came out. After Van Hagar came out, what I heard on the radio and from other people didn't inspire me much. I bought the Van Hagar box set because it was cheap, and I was like, well, I'm going to get it and give this outfit an honest opportunity, which it did. And honestly, these scores here are higher than they really would be. I think almost all of these are really probably between 45s and maybe 60, but more like 55s. I just don't like these albums, and I'm not going to say any more about it, okay? Now, after Balance, the band fell apart. They had issues with Sammy Hagar. Sammy Hagar had issues with them. This is the point where I believe Eddie Van Halen in particular is really struggling with alcohol addiction. They did put the next album together 3 years later, Van Halen III. This is not with Sammy Hagar or David Lee Roth. This is with Gary Cherone of what was the band he was in? Extreme. I was going to say Testament. It wasn't Testament. Gary Cherone is of Extreme fame, and he's a really capable kind of hard rock, heavy metal singer type. But the band was pretty dysfunctional at this point. From what I understand, if Wikipedia is to believe, Alex Van Halen didn't play drums on this album. They were played by others, I guess Eddie primarily. Michael Anthony played bass on only 3 songs, and there's very few of his trademark vocal harmonies. Gary Cherone, I don't like his sound any more than I like Sammy Hagar. He almost sounds like somebody trying to do Sammy Hagar. And I know some people say he doesn't sound anything like him, but he does to me kind of sound like it. Stephen Thomas Erlewin from AllMusic.com stated the album fails to break away from the formula that Van Halen had exhausted over 20 years earlier and suffers from the same problems as Hagar-era Van Halen. Limp riffs, weak melodies, and plodding, colorless rhythms. And I couldn't have said it better. That really sums up almost everything I feel about the post-David Lee Roth Van Halen. There is a really interesting song on here called Year to the Day. I should list the songs here. This is the longest song in Van Halen history. It's a sprawling 8-minute epic. It's almost progressive at times. It kind of works sometimes and then doesn't work at other points. I don't like the vocals because I don't like Gary Cherone at all, but we have a very lengthy, for Van Halen, guitar solo that's it's nearly 2.5 minutes long, and it works really, really well. And I feel like this is an area that Eddie kind of always wanted to explore and never did. This more ambitious, almost proggy, lengthier, more than 3-minute party rock songs, or 4-minute syrupy, synth-driven pop rock songs. I really wish he had explored some of that when the band was more functional than they were for this album. Primary is another instrumental. It's just 90 seconds, and again, it doesn't do much for me. And then How Many Say I is easily the most embarrassing effort in the entire catalog. This is a piano ballad with vocals by Eddie Van Halen, and as a vocalist, Eddie Van Halen is a great guitarist. He can't sing. His singing is not nearly as good as his keyboard playing, and his keyboard playing is pedestrian at best. This is just a wreck of an album in many ways. It was widely panned when it was released. It's considered a stain on the legacy of the band by most people. It's not David Lee Roth. It's not Sammy Hagar. As I hear, Michael Anthony and Alex Van Halen had little to do with it. So it's really an Eddie Van Halen solo album. Even the cover is bad. So, again, I don't want to beat up on a band when they're struggling. I just don't think this is a very good effort. And that was essentially the end of the band until a full decade later, or more than that, 14 years later, they had their swan song. They got back with David Lee Roth to do A Different Kind of Truth. And a couple things to note here. The first is, I believe at least half the songs that appear on this album were songs that were written way back in the 70s during the band's formative years, and they just got around to recording them here. And then the second thing is, David Lee Roth couldn't sing very well in the early part of the band's era, and now his vocals have degraded, and I find his singing to be nearly unlistenable on this album. Again, listening to this, I would not give these scores as high as I have. Like, here's how I know that, is whenever these songs come on random mixed playlists, I have lots of playlists that are, say, like, give me every 4-star song from the 80s, or give me every 4-star songs from the hard rock genre, or give me every 4-star song by Van Halen. I have lots of playlists like that that are governed by rules as opposed to me selecting which song I want to play. And I feel like every time one of these 4-star or 80 graded songs from A Different Truth comes on, I usually skip it. I just don't like them that much. I liked them when I first heard the album, and I thought this is pretty cool. Because overall, the music is really good, and this sounds like a Van Halen album from the original David Lee Roth days. They did a good job of that. I just don't think the songs are all that good, and then you add David Lee Roth's challenge vocals, and overall, like I say, I give this a 71. I think it's probably more like a 65 or 63, something like that, if I were to go back and re-rack, if you will. So that's it. Those are my scores. As you can see, I'm basically a Van Halen originalist. I like the early era with David Lee Roth, and I don't like the Sammy Hagar era, and I don't like the Gary Cherone album, and I don't really like the final David Lee Roth album. Now, part of that is probably just the fact that I was 15 when they were, in their early heyday with David Lee Roth, and by the time they were coming out with their later stuff, maybe I had my musical tastes had changed, and what interested me when I was 15 didn't interest me anymore when I was 30 years old. That's normal. Let's compare. I always do this. I like to compare my rankings to the aggregate rankings. They usually will use Progressive Archives, but Van Halen is not a progressive band, so they don't have any Van Halen scores on that website, but they do have a sister site called Metal Music Archives, and let's take a look at what they think of the scores. And you can see that in the first 5 albums, pretty consistent with mine. The only deviation is I like Women and Children First a little more than the Metal Music Archives crowd, and they like 1984 a little more than I do. So In terms of the David Lee Roth era, my grades are pretty consistent with what the metal music crowd thinks. But after that, you can see especially the first 3 Sammy Hagar albums, they like quite a bit, up in the upper 70s on all 3 of those, whereas I'm at 63 or below. And honestly, I would grade them lower now if I took time to go back and do it. We feel the same about Balance, although again my score would be lower. They don't like Van Halen 3 the same way nobody else does, and they feel about the same as I do, A Different Kind of Truth. So it's really that Van Hagar era there, especially those 3 albums. Again, those albums were massively successful. Each one was a #1 release. The tours were super successful. The band was successful. So it's just me who thinks that it wasn't very good. So that's it. That's my take on the legendary party rock band Van Halen. If you made it this far, I very much appreciate you taking time to spend with me. I hope you'll give me a like and maybe subscribe so you'll know the next time I am opining as the rock music guy. Hope you have a great day. See ya.